My figure skating coach told me to skate through the ankle pain. I severed my Achilles tendon mid-jump. She's coaching nobody. Her reputation is nuclear waste. Irina Volkov's voice cut through the arena during my short program warm-up at the Pacific Coast sectionals, sharp and insistent over the barrier separating coaches from the ice. Victoria, you're favoring the left ankle. Stop babying it. Push through. Champions don't feel pain. I'd told her that morning that something felt wrong in my ankle, a deep ache that had progressed from discomfort to sharp pain over the past week. She'd dismissed it with the same response she gave every injury complaint in our 7 years together. Mental weakness, lack of dedication, excuses from skaters who weren't hungry enough for gold. I was 19 years old, ranked 4th in the United States, and 3 months away from the Olympic trials that would determine whether I'd represent the country in Milan. 7 years of training under Irina at the Colorado Springs World Arena, 6 days a week, 4 hours daily, had brought me to the edge of my dreams. My triple axel was consistent, my artistry scores were climbing, and scouts from major sponsorship companies had started attending my competitions. Everything I'd sacrificed since age 12, every friendship abandoned for early morning ice time, every normal teenage experience traded for competition prep, was about to pay off. That ankle pain was just another obstacle to push through. Irina had coached 3 Olympic medalists and dozens of national champions. She knew what was required to succeed at elite levels. If she said skate through it, I skated through it. The warm-up ended and I took my starting position for the short program, the first of 2 performances that would determine my sectional placement and qualification for nationals. The music began, Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, dramatic and powerful. I executed my opening combination, a triple Lutz triple toe loop, landing clean despite the ankle screaming in protest. The pain was worse than it had been during warm-up, sharp and localized, radiating up my left leg with each landing. I pushed it aside and focused on the program, on hitting every element, on showing the judges that I deserved to advance. The step sequence went well, my edges crisp and precise. The flying camel spin felt solid. Then came the triple axel, positioned 2/3 through the program as my signature element, the jump that separated me from most of the other women in my division. I approached the takeoff, building speed on the back outside edge, preparing for the 3.5 rotations that would launch me into the air. As I vaulted off the ice, I felt something wrong immediately. The ankle didn't support the takeoff properly, the force transmitting through damaged tissue instead of healthy tendon and bone. Mid-rotation, still airborne, I felt the pop. Not a sound, but a sensation of something inside my ankle rupturing completely, separating, tearing apart under the rotational force and landing impact my body was generating. I came down on the left foot and my ankle collapsed entirely, folding inward, unable to bear any weight. I crashed into the ice face first, sliding into the boards with enough force to knock the wind from my lungs. The music continued playing while I lay on the ice, unable to stand, unable to even move my left leg without excruciating pain. Officials rushed onto the ice along with the event medical staff. I heard Irina shouting from the barrier, something about getting up and finishing the program, about not quitting in front of judges and scouts. The paramedics stabilized my ankle and helped me off the ice on a stretcher, my competition over, my Olympic dreams suspended in the horrible uncertainty of not knowing what had just happened inside my body, but knowing it was catastrophic. The emergency room doctor at the local hospital examined my ankle and ordered immediate imaging. X-rays showed no fractures, but the ultrasound revealed the full horror. Complete Achilles tendon rupture with retraction, meaning the tendon had torn completely through and the 2 ends had separated by several centimeters. The doctor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a calm voice, explained that this was a severe injury requiring emergency surgery to reconnect the tendon ends before too much time passed, and scarring made repair more difficult. He asked questions about what I'd been feeling before the injury, what warning signs I'd experienced. I told him about the week of increasing pain, about telling my coach, about being instructed to push through it. His expression shifted to something between anger and disbelief. You continued training and competing on an ankle that was warning you it was failing? Your coach knew about the pain and told you to ignore it? I nodded, and he made extensive notes in my chart before explaining that Achilles tendon ruptures didn't happen suddenly in healthy athletes. They were almost always preceded by tendinopathy, chronic inflammation, and microtearing that weakened the tendon structure until catastrophic failure occurred. My ankle had been telling me for weeks that something was seriously wrong, and continuing to train on it had guaranteed the complete rupture that might have been prevented with rest and treatment. The surgery happened that night, 3 hours under anesthesia, while an orthopedic surgeon reconnected my severed tendon and anchored it with sutures and screws. I woke up in recovery with my left leg immobilized in a cast from toes to knee, instructions for 6 weeks of non-weight bearing followed by months of careful rehabilitation, and the surgeon's honest assessment that I'd never skate competitively again. Achilles tendon ruptures in elite athletes were career-ending injuries, even with optimal surgical repair and rehabilitation. The tendon would never regain its original strength and elasticity. I'd be able to walk normally eventually, possibly even jog or participate in low-impact activities, but the explosive power and precise control required for triple jumps and competitive skating was gone permanently. My mother sat beside the hospital bed and cried silently, understanding what this meant for the future we'd both invested everything in pursuing. My father stood at the window, his face hard, asking questions about liability and negligence, about whether coaches had duties to protect their athletes from preventable injuries. Irina hadn't visited the hospital or called to check on my condition. Her only communication had been a text message to my mother, saying that Victoria had given up during a critical competition and embarrassed the coaching program in front of national officials. She was terminating our coaching contract effective immediately and would not be accepting me back to the training facility. I was being abandoned at my lowest moment by the woman who'd shaped my entire athletic identity, blamed for an injury she'd caused through her negligence and dismissed as a failure for having the nerve to get hurt. The sports medicine specialist I saw for my 2-week post-surgery follow-up was more blunt about culpability than the emergency room doctor had been. Dr. Ellen Rourke had worked with Olympic athletes for 20 years and had strong opinions about coaching practices that prioritized results over athlete welfare. She reviewed my medical records, examined my surgical site, and asked detailed questions about my training history with Irina. When I described the pattern of injury dismissal, the constant pressure to train through pain, the verbal abuse disguised as motivation, her expression darkened. What you're describing is abusive coaching that violates every principle of safe athletic development. Elite coaches are supposed to be experts in injury recognition and prevention. They're supposed to protect young athletes from overuse injuries and catastrophic failures. Irina Volkov has a reputation in the figure skating community for pushing athletes beyond reasonable limits, and several of her former students have experienced serious injuries that ended their careers prematurely. Your case is especially egregious because you explicitly reported pain and she ordered you to ignore it and compete anyway. That's not tough coaching. That's reckless endangerment. Dr. Rourke explained that she'd be documenting everything in my medical records, including the pattern of symptoms I'd reported to my coach and the coach's instruction to continue training despite warning signs. This documentation could be valuable if I chose to pursue any kind of formal complaint or legal action against Irina or the training facility that employed her. She also connected me with a sports psychologist who specialized in helping athletes process career-ending injuries and coaching abuse, recognizing that my recovery would need to address psychological trauma alongside physical rehabilitation. The psychological impact of losing my skating career hit harder than the physical pain of recovery. I'd been a competitive figure skater since age 6, had built my entire identity around the sport, had sacrificed normal childhood and adolescent development for the singular pursuit of Olympic glory. Now that was gone, amputated as completely as if I'd lost the leg entirely. I spent weeks in my parents' house in suburban Denver, immobilized and grieving, scrolling through social media posts about sectionals results and watching other skaters advance to nationals, while I sat on the couch with my leg elevated. Irina had already replaced me with a younger student, a 15-year-old with clean technique and ambitious parents, posting training videos and praising her dedication and mental toughness. The implied criticism was clear. This new girl was what Victoria Crane had failed to be, strong enough to handle elite training, dedicated enough to push through discomfort. The post felt deliberately cruel, designed to punish me for getting injured and making her look bad. My former training partners, girls I'd spent years alongside, stopped responding to my messages. Irina controlled access to the premier training facility in Colorado, and maintaining relationships with a discarded student would risk their own standing in her program. I'd been erased from the community that had been my entire social world, excommunicated for the sin of catastrophic injury. Physical therapy started 8 weeks post-surgery when the cast came off, and I was cleared to begin gentle range of motion exercises. The therapist, a woman named Margaret Chen. No, I need a different name. The therapist, a woman named Margaret Bowman who worked extensively with injured athletes, was honest about my prognosis from our first session. We're going to work toward getting you back to full function for daily activities and possibly low-impact sports. But I need you to understand that competitive figure skating at your previous level is not a realistic goal. The Achilles tendon is the strongest tendon in the body, and yours suffered complete rupture. Even with excellent surgical repair, we're looking at maybe 80 to 85% of original strength at absolute best. The explosive force required for triple jumps is beyond what your repaired tendon will safely tolerate. Attempting those movements would likely result in re-rupture and even worse outcomes. She wasn't trying to destroy my hope, just establish realistic expectations, but hearing the professional confirmation of what the surgeon had told me made the loss feel final and irreversible. I'd never compete at nationals, never make the Olympic team, never fulfill the dream that had justified every sacrifice. Margaret's approach to therapy was methodical and conservative, carefully rebuilding my ankle's strength and range of motion through graduated exercises that never pushed into dangerous territory. Progress was measured in millimeters and small victories: pointing my toe without pain, bearing full weight on the injured leg, walking without a limp. Each achievement felt simultaneously monumental and devastating, celebrating basic function that I'd taken for granted before while mourning the explosive athleticism I'd lost permanently. My parents were struggling financially within 3 months of my injury. My father worked as an electrical engineer, and my mother had given up her teaching career when I was 12 to manage my training schedule and competition travel. We'd lived skating first for years, budgeting around coaching fees, ice time rental, competition entry costs, travel expenses, costume design, and all the other financial requirements of elite figure skating. The family income had been stretched thin supporting my athletic career with the understanding that eventual sponsorship deals and prize money would justify the investment. That future was gone now, but the debt remained. The medical bills were staggering even with insurance coverage. Emergency room visit, surgery, anesthesia, hospital stay, orthopedic surgeon fees, physical therapy sessions 3 times weekly for months. The bills kept arriving, each one representing thousands of dollars in out-of-pocket expenses that my family couldn't afford. My parents had taken out a home equity loan to cover my final year of training expenses, banking on Olympic qualification generating enough sponsorship income to repay it. Now they were facing bankruptcy while I sat immobilized in their living room, the physical embodiment of a catastrophic failed investment. The guilt was crushing, knowing that my career had consumed their financial security and given them nothing in return except debt and a disabled daughter who needed ongoing medical care. I spent my recovery researching Irina Volkov and discovering that my experience wasn't unique or even unusual. Online forums for figure skaters, particularly former competitive athletes, contained dozens of stories about her coaching methods. Girls who'd trained under her described the same pattern I'd experienced: constant verbal abuse disguised as tough love motivation, ignoring injury complaints and demanding athletes train through pain, creating environments where admitting physical limitations was treated as mental weakness and moral failure. Several former students described career-ending injuries that had occurred under Irina's coaching. Stress fractures that progressed to complete breaks when athletes were forced to continue training. Concussions that went untreated because Irina dismissed them as excuses. Eating disorders that developed under pressure to maintain unrealistically low weights for aesthetic scoring. The pattern was clear and consistent across years of coaching, but somehow Irina had maintained her reputation and continued coaching at elite levels without consequences. One forum post was from a woman named Diana Shepard, who'd trained under Irina 15 years earlier and suffered a similar Achilles injury at age 17. She'd filed a complaint with U.S. Figure Skating, the national governing body, reporting Irina's negligence and abusive practices. The complaint had been dismissed after a cursory investigation that accepted Irina's version of events over Diana's. She'd been labeled a disgruntled former student making false accusations, and her figure skating career had ended not just from injury, but from being blacklisted by coaches who viewed her complaint as betrayal of the coaching community. I reached out to Diana through the forum, and we spoke on the phone for over 2 hours. She'd lost her skating career the same way I had, pushed to compete on an injury that her coach had dismissed, suffering catastrophic tendon failure that could have been prevented with basic medical care and rest. In the 15 years since, she'd tried multiple times to hold Irina accountable, filing complaints with U.S. Figure Skating, reporting to the training facility where Irina worked, even consulting attorneys about civil litigation. Every effort had been stonewalled by institutions that protected coaches over athletes, especially when the coaches brought prestige and winning records to their organizations. Diana had eventually given up, rebuilt her life outside of skating, and tried to move on. But she'd never stopped monitoring Irina's career, tracking new students, watching for patterns of abuse that she knew would continue unchecked. She'd been waiting for years for another victim willing to fight back, someone with enough recent evidence and willingness to endure the process to finally bring consequences. When she heard my story, she saw an opportunity for accountability that had eluded her own case. We started collaborating, pooling our documentation and experiences, identifying other former students who'd been harmed by Irina's methods. Diana had maintained contact with several women from her era who'd trained under Irina and experienced similar abuse. Together, we created a detailed timeline of Irina's coaching career spanning 20 years, documenting injuries, abuse allegations, athlete complaints, and the institutional responses that had consistently protected her while dismissing victims. The attorney I consulted about civil litigation was honest about the challenges of suing a figure skating coach for negligence. Sports injury cases were complex because athletic training inherently involved risk, and coaches had significant legal protection under assumption of risk doctrines. Proving that Irina's coaching had fallen below the standard of care required expert testimony, establishing what reasonable coaches would do in similar circumstances, and that Irina's actions had deviated from that standard in ways that directly caused my injury. The attorney, David Kuhn, specialized in sports law and had handled several cases involving coaching negligence. He reviewed my medical records, the documentation of my reports to Irina about ankle pain, and the pattern of similar injuries among her former students. His assessment was cautiously optimistic. You have a stronger case than most because you explicitly told your coach about pain, and she specifically instructed you to ignore it and compete. That's documented in your medical records through what you reported to doctors immediately after the injury. We can also establish a pattern of similar conduct with other athletes, showing this wasn't an isolated mistake but a consistent coaching philosophy that prioritized results over athlete safety. The challenge will be proving causation definitively, showing that rest would have prevented the complete rupture. But with the right medical experts, I think we can build a compelling case. The bigger question is whether you're prepared for the process. Irina will fight this aggressively, and the figure skating community tends to rally around accused coaches rather than supporting athlete plaintiffs. You'll be portrayed as bitter, vindictive, unable to accept that your career ended because you weren't tough enough. This will be ugly and public. I filed the civil suit 6 months after my injury, seeking damages for medical expenses, lost future earnings from the skating career and sponsorships I would have secured, and pain and suffering from the injury and emotional trauma. David structured the complaint to tell a compelling story rather than just listing legal claims, detailing my years of training, my Olympic aspirations, the week of ankle pain I'd reported to Irina, her specific instruction to compete despite the pain, the catastrophic rupture during competition, and the permanent career-ending consequences. We included claims for negligence, reckless endangerment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress based on Irina's pattern of abusive coaching. The complaint was public record, and within days it generated media coverage from sports journalists who specialized in covering athlete welfare issues. The story had all the elements of an engaging narrative: young Olympic hopeful, abusive coach, preventable injury, career destroyed, institution failing to protect athletes. Several journalists reached out to interview me, wanting to understand the broader patterns of coaching abuse in figure skating. I gave careful interviews that focused on systemic issues rather than just my personal grievance, explaining that Irina represented a larger problem of elite coaches who were protected by institutions that valued medals over athlete welfare. Diana and 3 other former students went public with their own stories, creating a chorus of voices that made it impossible to dismiss us as isolated complainers. U.S. Figure Skating initially responded to the lawsuit with a boilerplate statement about not commenting on pending litigation, but the media coverage created pressure for more substantive action. Athletes' rights organizations that monitored Olympic sports started calling for investigation into coaching abuse in figure skating, citing my case and the pattern of similar incidents involving other coaches. The U.S. Center for Safe Sport, an independent organization created to investigate abuse in Olympic sports, opened a case file on Irina based on multiple complaints from former students. Safe Sport had broader investigative powers than U.S. Figure Skating and wasn't beholden to the coaching community or concerned about protecting the sport's reputation. Their investigators contacted me, Diana, and the other women who'd come forward, conducting detailed interviews about our experiences with Irina. They reviewed medical records, training logs, and communications, building a comprehensive case file that documented decades of abusive coaching practices. The Safe Sport investigation moved slowly, but it represented an independent accountability mechanism that couldn't be controlled by the institutions that had protected Irina for years. Their ultimate authority included the power to ban coaches from participation in Olympic sports permanently, effectively ending careers regardless of what happened in civil court. The training facility where Irina coached, the Colorado Performance Center, initially stood by her when the lawsuit was filed. Their public statement defended her coaching record and suggested that my injury was an unfortunate accident, rather than the result of negligence. But as more former students came forward with stories of abuse and injury, and as the Safe Sport investigation became public knowledge, the facility's position shifted. They suspended Irina pending the outcome of the investigations, a face-saving measure that allowed them to claim they took abuse allegations seriously while not fully committing to termination. The suspension meant Irina couldn't coach at the facility or use her association with their brand, effectively eliminating her primary income source and damaging her reputation. Her current students, including the 15-year-old who'd replaced me, were transferred to other coaches. Several of those families explicitly requested coaches known for prioritizing athlete welfare over winning at any cost, making clear they'd lost trust in Irina's methods. The figure skating community was fracturing over the allegations, with some coaches and officials defending Irina as a victim of vindictive former students, while others acknowledged that coaching culture in the sport had tolerated abusive practices for too long and needed reform. The deposition process was brutal. Irina's attorney spent 8 hours questioning me about every detail of my training history, my injury, and my motivations for filing suit. They suggested I was exaggerating the pain I'd reported to Irina, that I'd actually sustained the tendon damage through poor technique rather than overuse, that my career prospects had been mediocre anyway, and I was using the injury as an excuse for inevitable competitive failure. They brought up my treatment for anxiety 2 years earlier, suggesting I was emotionally unstable and prone to catastrophic thinking. They questioned whether I'd really told Irina about the ankle pain or whether I'd manufactured that detail after the injury to create a negligence case. David had prepared me for these tactics, explaining that defense attorneys always tried to attack the plaintiff's credibility and suggest alternative causation. But sitting across from lawyers who were paid to destroy my character and deny my reality was emotionally devastating in ways I hadn't anticipated. The only satisfaction came from Irina's own deposition, where she made strategic mistakes that strengthened our case. She was defensive and dismissive, referring to me as weak and uncommitted, describing the ankle pain I'd reported as typical athlete complaining that coaches learn to ignore. She actually said during deposition that champions pushed through pain and that coddling athletes with minor discomfort created mentally soft competitors who would never succeed at elite levels. Her words, captured in sworn testimony, perfectly demonstrated the coaching philosophy that had caused my injury and vindicated everything I'd been saying about her methods. The discovery process revealed documentation that significantly strengthened our case. Emails between Irina and the Colorado Performance Center's management showed that she'd been informally warned multiple times over the years about her treatment of athletes. 3 different facility managers had expressed concerns about her verbal abuse and injury management practices, But no formal disciplinary action had ever been taken because she produced winning skaters who brought prestige to the facility. One email from 5 years earlier specifically mentioned a stress fracture case where Irina had allegedly pressured an athlete to compete before medical clearance, resulting in complete bone failure and permanent damage. The facility had settled that case quietly without admitting liability, and Irina had continued coaching without restrictions. The documentation proved that both Irina and the facility had been on notice that her methods were dangerous, and that they'd consciously chosen to prioritize winning over athlete safety. David added the Colorado Performance Center as an additional defendant in the lawsuit, arguing that they'd negligently supervised Irina and failed to protect athletes from known dangers. The facility's insurance company immediately began settlement negotiations, recognizing that the discovery documents made their liability exposure significant. My physical recovery plateaued around 12 months post-injury at roughly 75% of my original ankle function, slightly below what the surgeon had hoped for, but within the expected range for complete Achilles ruptures. I could walk normally without visible limp, manage stairs, drive a car, and participate in low-impact activities. Running remained difficult and painful, my stride awkward and compromised by the ankle's limited range of motion and strength. I'd attempted to skate a few times on public ice sessions, just basic forward stroking without jumps or spins, but even that felt wrong. My body remembered the explosive power and precise control I'd once commanded, and moving on the ice with such limitations was more painful than rewarding. I'd lost not just my career but my primary form of self-expression and joy. Figure skating had been how I understood myself, how I moved through the world, how I processed emotion. That language was gone now, and I hadn't yet found another way to exist that felt authentic. The sports psychologist I'd been seeing weekly helped me work through the grief and identity reconstruction, recognizing that I was mourning not just a career, but the person I'd been. The Victoria Crane who'd dedicated everything to Olympic dreams was dead. I needed to discover who I could become without skating defining me, but that process was slow and painful and ongoing. The Safe Sport investigation concluded 18 months after my injury with findings that Irina had violated multiple athlete welfare policies through her pattern of dismissing injuries, pressuring athletes to train through medical contraindications, and creating an abusive environment that prioritized winning over safety. The report detailed incidents spanning 20 years involving at least 17 different athletes who'd experienced serious injuries or psychological harm under her coaching. Safe Sport issued a permanent ban prohibiting Irina from coaching, officiating, or participating in any capacity in figure skating or other Olympic sports under U.S. jurisdiction. The ban was comprehensive and absolute, destroying her career completely. She could never work in the sport again, never attend competitions as a coach, never associate herself professionally with figure skating. Her reputation was nuclear waste, exactly as the ban intended. U.S. figure skating was required to enforce the Safe Sport ban, and did so by removing Irina from all coaching registries and circulating notices to skating clubs and training facilities nationwide. Several facilities where she'd held guest coaching workshops issued statements apologizing for hosting her and committing to better vetting processes. The International Skating Union, which governed figure skating globally, recognized the Safe Sport ban and extended it internationally, meaning Irina couldn't simply move to another country and continue coaching. Her career was over everywhere, permanently. The civil trial was scheduled for 2 years after my injury, but settlement negotiations intensified after the Safe Sport ban was announced. The ban gave credibility to our allegations and eliminated Irina's ability to argue that she was a respected coach whose methods were within professional norms. David leveraged the Safe Sport findings effectively, pointing out to the defense that a jury would hear about the permanent ban and the 17 athletes who'd been harmed. Irina's insurance company wanted to settle, and even Irina herself recognized that trial would be catastrophic for her. The settlement we reached included $2.3 million in compensation, structured to cover my past and future medical expenses, my lost earning potential from skating and sponsorships, and damages for pain and suffering. The Colorado Performance Center contributed an additional $800,000 as part of their settlement, along with commitments to implement new athlete welfare policies and independent oversight of coaching practices. The settlement agreements included no confidentiality clauses because David insisted that public accountability was essential. Irina would pay consequences that everyone could see, and other athletes would know they could come forward without being silenced. The settlement felt like vindication, but not quite justice. Money couldn't restore my career or give me back the years of my life consumed by skating, but it provided financial security and eliminated the medical debt that had been crushing my family. More importantly, it sent a message that abusive coaches could face real consequences when athletes refused to stay silent. The figure skating community underwent significant changes in the aftermath of my case and the Safe Sport investigation. U.S. figure skating implemented new athlete welfare policies requiring coaches to complete abuse prevention training, establishing confidential reporting mechanisms for athlete complaints, and creating independent oversight committees to investigate coaching practices. Several other high-profile coaches faced scrutiny, and some were removed from positions or had their practices restricted based on athlete complaints that had previously been ignored. The sport hadn't transformed overnight, but cracks had appeared in the culture of coach protection, and athletes had more pathways to accountability. Diana Shepard and I started an athlete advocacy organization called Safe Landing Foundation, focused on educating figure skaters about their rights and providing resources for reporting abusive coaching. We partnered with sports psychologists and attorneys to offer free consultations for athletes navigating injury disputes or abuse allegations. In our first year, we assisted 23 skaters with various complaints ranging from eating disorder pressure to injury dismissal to verbal abuse. Several coaches faced disciplinary action based on complaints filed through our organization, and we were building a network of athlete voices that institutions could no longer easily dismiss. The work felt meaningful in ways that competitive skating never had, using my experience to protect others from similar harm. Irina's life after the ban was dramatically diminished according to occasional updates from the skating community. She'd lost her Colorado Springs apartment and moved back to Russia, where her coaching certification wasn't recognized and she had no professional network. Her social media accounts, which had once showcased her successful students and coaching achievements, went dormant after the ban. She'd attempted to launch an online coaching business offering video analysis and training advice, but safe sport regulations prohibited her from coaching in any capacity, and her past students organized reporting campaigns that got her accounts shut down for violating platform terms of service. She was radioactive professionally, unemployable in the only field she'd ever worked in, her name synonymous with abuse and destroyed careers. Some people expressed sympathy for her, suggesting the consequences were excessive for mistakes made in pursuit of athletic excellence. But the 17 athletes documented in the Safe Sport report, each with their own story of injury or trauma under her coaching, made clear this wasn't about mistakes. It was about a systematic pattern of valuing medals over human welfare, choosing to harm young athletes rather than adjust methods, refusing accountability until external forces made continued coaching impossible. She'd earned every consequence she'd received. I enrolled in college 3 years after my injury, pursuing a degree in sports management with a focus on athlete advocacy and policy reform. The scholarship opportunities I'd once expected through skating were gone, but the settlement provided tuition funding, and I qualified for academic scholarships based on my high school performance. My ankle had settled into its permanent limitations, functional enough for daily life but always present, always reminding me of what I'd lost and why I was doing this work. I skated occasionally for enjoyment, basic programs at public sessions without jumps or competitive elements, just moving to music and feeling the ice beneath my blades. It was bittersweet but healing, reclaiming some relationship with the sport on my own terms rather than abandoning it completely. My classmates didn't know my history unless I chose to share it, allowing me to build identity around current interests rather than past trauma. But I brought my experience into class discussions about athlete welfare, challenging professors and classmates to consider how sports institutions prioritized winning over participant safety and what structural changes were necessary to protect athletes from exploitation. 4 years after my injury, I attended U.S. Nationals as a credentialed advocate representing Safe Landing Foundation, monitoring coaching practices and athlete welfare. I watched young skaters perform with the technical difficulty and artistic interpretation that I'd once commanded, feeling complex emotions. Pride in their achievements, grief for my lost career, protectiveness toward these athletes who were navigating the same dangerous systems that had destroyed me. Between events, I met with current skaters to discuss their rights and resources available if they experienced coaching abuse or injury pressure. Several athletes approached me privately, sharing concerns about their coaches that they'd been afraid to voice publicly. I connected them with appropriate resources and documented their concerns for potential future action. The work was slow and often frustrating, pushing against institutional inertia and cultural norms that resisted change. But it mattered. Every coach who faced consequences, every athlete who reported abuse without retaliation, every policy reform that added oversight and accountability represented progress toward a safer sport. Irina Volkov was coaching nobody, her reputation destroyed and her career permanently ended. And I was coaching everyone, building systems that would protect the next generation of athletes from the destruction she'd caused. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.